to just end off, because today is a siyum, and the siyum is of course something very, very special. So I know not everyone's going to be able to stay with us till the end of the share. I wanted to share with you a closing thought on the siyum of today's of the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh. We see through the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh, there's almost this perpetual tension between two competing principles of what makes Kiddush HaChedesh. What are the two main pillars of Kiddush HaChedesh? Of sanctifying the new moon. How do we sanctify the new moon? We need two critical, almost polar opposite ideas to come into play or to match up, to align. Don't worry, there's no wrong answers. There's nothing mathematical about it either, by the way. So don't be scared.
We've got to find the position of the sun and the moon to be able to determine.
So you have to have witnesses who see the position of the moon, right? Now, what power do we as people have over seeing the moon? Zero, right? It's purely in the hands of God. First of all, that there shouldn't be clouds. Second of all, that the moon is not always visible, even if there are in clouds. It's not necessarily will you be able to see it. That there should be people at the right time, because you never know where to stand, where to look. So on the one hand, the sanctification of the new moon is totally sort of from above. Hashem's nature has to align. And on the other hand, as we've been learning for the last 2.5 weeks, what's the other side of the sanctification of the new moon? What's that?
Our decision. The decision of the court.
The Sanhedrin have to be incredible astronomers, mathematicians. There's a huge amount of knowledge, of law, of our work that we have to put in. We have to invest our minds, the gifts that Hashem have given us. We need to apply to them to understand and study these laws so thoroughly. So it's on the one hand entirely from Hashem, and on the other hand entirely from us. And perhaps that's why the first mitzvah that we read in the Torah, which we read about this Shabbos, this week, on Wednesday, what's the first mitzvah of the Torah? It's Kiddush HaChedesh. Because in truth, this is what Judaism is all about. Shabbat, gift from Hashem. But it's the way I keep it, the way I observe it, my traditions, my customs. Obviously, the laws that Hashem gives us are untouchable, and we have to observe them as they are. But we then need to apply ourselves. Everything of Yiddishkeit, of Torah, of Judaism, is this merge of heaven and earth, above and below, and that's why it comes out in this magnificent teaching. So we're going to continue now with the laws, and if you have you should have also the text available as well on your screen. You can just follow each one.
Tisha Asar, chapter 19. This is the final chapter of Hilchas Kiddush HaChedesh, where the Rambam deals with one more detail of the cross-examination of the witnesses when they would come to the court to testify that they saw the new moon, and some concluding remarks that he makes about these halachas. Halacha Aleph. Lafisha Amru Chachamim. Because our sages, since our sages have said, Shebechlal Dvarim Shayaboitkin Behenes Ha'edin, that within the questions that they gave the witnesses, that they checked the witnesses, examined them, one of these questions were, they would say to them, in which direction was the moon tilted or inclined? Which way was the moon? we know that at the beginning of the month, the moon is a crescent like a banana, a thin crescent. The question is, which way is it inclined? Which means, which way is it facing? If you ever look at the moon in the beginning of the month, sometimes it's straight up, like a U, and sometimes it's facing a little bit on an angle or completely on an angle to the right, and sometimes to the left. So which way is it? Because they would ask the witnesses this question, I feel that it's appropriate to explain the way the court would calculate this and figure out to ask the witnesses this question. This time, when it comes to the calculation, I am not going to be exact, says the Rambam. This will be very approximate, because this calculation to know which way the moon was facing did not help at all whether it would be sighted or not. That we learned in the previous chapters, how thick and thin, narrow or wide the crescent will be, how high up in the sky, how long it will take for the moon to set on below the horizon, but the direction of the crescent is not, the calculations to know which way it's facing does not affect at all whether you're going to see the moon or not. So this was only to ask them a general question if they paid attention to that detail, which they should have, and therefore we're going to give approximate calculations with this. To know the starting point of these calculations, you have to know the degree of the incline of the constellations. The concept here, the Rambam already dealt with in previous chapters, not directly though, but it was a given when he was telling us the calculations of finding the sun's correct position and the moon's position in regard to the constellations. We already explained, although he didn't explicitly write it, but it was included in the mathematics, that the path of the sun under the constellations, or that the belt of the constellations in the sky, is not directly parallel to the equator. It's the Earth that we divide the equator in half is not that just above the equator, around the equator in the sky, that's where the line of the constellations are. We already learned that the constellations are a belt surrounding the whole sky, and this belt is tilted off the equator. Half of the constellations are north of the equator, half of the constellations are south of the equator, and that's how we dealt with many of the calculations. Here the Rambam will explain it explicitly how it works. The orbit that passes through the center of the constellations. Now, because we know, if you look basic astronomy, the constellations are not a bunch of stars in a line. It's a bunch of stars that occupy a tremendous amount of space in heaven, in the sky. They're just parallel, they're just in line in a complete orbit, and in the center of those calculations we have a figurative belt, an orbit, and in that orbit is how the Rambam explained to us the sun makes its annual cycle. So this circle, this sphere, does not pass through the center of the earth, or the center of the world, we should say, from half of east to half of west, which means the world he calls from earth, he calls us the center. So when we look up into the sky, the constellations is not from exactly half of east to half of west, which means it's not North Pole, South Pole, and right in the middle, above the equator and below the equator. That's where these constellations, or around the equator, that's where they go. This circle, this orbit is inclined away or above, or away from the equator. That the equator is exactly in the center of the earth. Northward and southward. Half of this circle is inclined to the north, and half is to the south. So if we have the earth, we have the equator around. In the sky we have this great orbit around the equator, but half of it is this way and half of it is that way. It's inclined, so exactly half at 0.0 and 0.360 is where it crisscrosses the equator, it intersects. The other half is to the north and to the south. The Rambam says in Halacha Gimel there are 2 points at which the orbit of the sun intersects in the circle that's around the world parallel to the equator. That surrounds the center of of the earth. The first point is at the beginning of the constellation of the sheep, of Aries, 0 degrees of the 360-degree orbit, which is where the sun is at the spring equinox. And the second point, exactly opposite that, 180 degrees, Reish Mazel Maznayim, the beginning of the constellation of the scales, which is where the sun is at the autumnal equinox. The Nimtzu, so because this orbit is touching or is crisscrossing the equator in these two specific places, so then the conclusion is there's exactly Shisha Mazolos Noitus Letzafain, 6 of the constellations tilt, incline to the north, Mitchilas Tolat Soif Besula, from Aries, beginning of Aries until the end of Virgo, the Shisha Noitus Ledarim, and 6 of the constellations incline southerly, Mitchilas Mazel Meznaim, the beginning of the constellation of the scales, Atsoif Mazel Dagam, until the end of the Pisces. So it's exactly half and half. When you have that, that means that just at the beginning of, after 0 degrees, the constellations start moving northward until 90 degrees, its maximum incline to the north, comes back down to the equator for the next 90 degrees, till 180. From 180 to 270, it moves away from the equator southern direction, and from 270 to 360, it moves back up to the level of the equator. This is what he explains in the next halacha. Halacha dal, the Reish Mazel Toleh, from the beginning of the constellation of the sheep, Yaschilu hamazolis lintos ma'at ma'at. Slowly the constellations, as we move along the constellations, the angle moves bit by bit northward, and diverge away from the equator, northern direction, until 90 degrees, which is the beginning of the constellation of the crab. So how far north does this orbit go away from the equator? The 90 degrees, the furthest distance. It is distant from the equator northerly. It is approximately 23 degrees and a half. As we said, the Rambam is not going to be specific here, so the details are not important. It was only important for the previous calculations in the previous chapters when we were trying to figure out exact position of sun and moon. Here it's just a general angle, so it's enough to know that it's 23.5 degrees. After 90 degrees, the constellations begin coming back. They travel back southward towards the equator, still on the north side. Until the beginning of scales, which then the constellations once again intersect with the equator. And from the head of the scales constellation, the constellations go in an angle southward to the southern side of the equator, until the beginning of the goat constellation, Capricorn. And the beginning of the constellation of the goat is again on the furthest point south of the equator, approximately 23.5 degrees. And then from 270 back up to 360, it's still on the south side, but going northward, back up to 0 degrees, until the beginning of the sheep, where it intersects again, and it's exactly above the equator. Nimtza Reish Tole v'Reish Meiznayim Mesabev ala Kav HaShaveh. In Halacha 5, the Rambam says thus: in the daily orbit, when we have the sky, when we see sunrise and sunset, it is exactly above the equator when it's at 0 degrees and 180 degrees. When the sun is at these 2 points of 0 and 180, it will not deviate to the north or to the south. So although the circle of the constellation, the equator is here and the circle is off center, nevertheless, when the daily cycle, according to the Rambam, is turning the whole universe, so this whole crooked circle goes up and down, it's going directly above the equator. So when the sun is 0 and 180, it is directly on top of the equator. Because we always live on the north, so we never see the sun actually straight on top of our heads. Because we live more than 23 degrees north of the equator. So the only when you live in the southern countries or closer to the equator can you see, within 23 degrees, there's a time of the year where the sun will be directly above you, and there will be completely zero shade. But where we live, United States or Israel, what the Rambam explained, you never actually have the sun directly above you, so you have zero shadow, because we're always more north. Anyway. V'tizrach b'chatzi mizrach v'tishka b'chatzi ma'irav. When the sun is at 0 and 180, it rises exactly above the center of the earth, above the equator, on the half of the east. V'tishka b'chatzi ma'irav, and the sunset is exactly on the west. And day and night are exactly the same amount of minutes. You have the day and the night exactly equal, 12 hours and 12 hours. Halacha vav. So once we know the physical position of these constellations, so it's clear to you that all these degrees from the degrees of the orbit of the constellations either tilt to the north or to the south, besides the point of 0 or the point of 180. There's an exact amount, how much incline there is to the north or south. The maximum amount of offset off the equator will never be more than 23 and approximately a half a degree. So once we know that it deviates at 90 degrees maximum 23 and a half, so now we're going to go by groups of degrees at a time how much the constellations are off the equator. These are the constellation offset of the equator according to the number of degrees of the sphere of the constellations. And let's begin from the constellation of Sheep, and we go eastward. We know that the constellations go not from east to west, but the order is from west to east. So from Aries, Eser Miles, once it reaches 10 degrees, and Nitiyasam Arba Miles. So it's in the orbit of 10 degrees, it's north above the equator 4 degrees. Eser Miles at 20 degrees, Nitiyasam Shmeina Miles, it's already 8 degrees above the equator. Shleisha Miles at 30 degrees, Nitiyasam Achasas Miles Omechze, it is 11.5 degrees. Arboy Miles, once you hit 40 degrees, Nitiyasam Chameshes Miles, then it's off the equator to north 15 degrees. Chamisha Miles at 50 degrees, Nitiyasam Shmeina Esrei Miles, the incline is 18 degrees. Shisha Miles, when you travel 60 degrees on the constellation, it's Nitiyasam Esrei Miles. Now you're already off north of the equator 20 degrees. Shiva Miles at 70 degrees, Nitiyasam Shtayim Esrei Miles, the offset is 22 degrees. Shmeina Miles at 80 degrees, Nitiyasam Shalosh Veshna Miles, at 80 degrees it's already 23 degrees north. Tisha Miles at 90 degrees, the maximum at 90 degrees. Nitiyasam Sholish ve'esrim miles v'chatzi miles, 23.5 degrees, and this is at 90 degrees where we finished the first 3 constellations of the sheep, the bull, and the twins. This is from 0 to 90. What if it'll be by decimals? What if it's like 43 or 55? If it's not exactly 10, 20, 30 degrees into the constellations, if you're on ones, then you do the basic mathematical calculation, as we explained before in the sun and the moon, chapter 13 and chapter 15. The same method. Ketzad, for instance, Chamesh Miles, if it's at 5 degrees, it's 2 degrees, because we know at 0 there's nothing. At 10 degrees it already reaches north 4 degrees. So at 5 degrees it's half of 10, so that's 2 degrees. For instance, if it was 23 degrees in the orbit, then the offset north is 9 degrees. And the same things with all the ones, the singular numbers that are between the decimals, that has units, in other words, the single numbers that have both 10 and single numbers. Halacha tes. Once he gave you the table from 1 to 90, now he doesn't continue from 90 to 180 to 270 to 360. Once you have 90 degree angle, then you can apply the same table from 90 to 180 and the same table from 180 to 270, etc. So once you know the table from 0 to 90, now you can figure out the degree of inclination in the sphere of the equator, just like we figured out by the moon's latitude. If the number was somewhere between 90 and 180, then you minus off that number from 180, and you have a number somewhere between 0 and 90, and that's how you figure out how far north it is. If the number in the constellations were somewhere between 180 degrees and 270 degrees, then you minus off 180, and the total number is where you're at, again, between 0 and 90. What if it was between 270 and 360? You minus it off, you subtract it from 360. The total that you have, you automatically will know the incline. This will be the incline of the number that you will come to, which will always be between 0 and 190, without addition or subtraction. Halacha Yud. This is all till now to know the constellations, or basically the sun, how far north or south it's off the equator. But in the beginning of this chapter, the Rambam said what we are asking the witnesses is not where the sun was, but where the moon is. If the moon, the crescent, was straight up, or to the right, or to the left. So to this we have to add the latitude of the moon as well. So that's what he adds in Halacha Yud. After these calculations that you know the position of the constellations, how far north or south they are of the equator, the celestial sphere. Yud im tirza leila kama milos leida kama milos wana yoreach noitim ala kava shava keneged tzveina olam keneged reima olam. If you want to know the number of degrees by which the moon's position deviates off the equator, north or south, first you have to know, calculate where is the moon's true position, which we learned in the previous chapter. We already learned a chapter to figure out the true position of the moon under the star signs in heaven. Once we figure out the moon's true position, that gave us the position where it is in the constellations. So there you already figure out, based on this chapter, if the moon is to the north and how much to the north or to the south it is. Then it's not enough, because the moon does not travel under the constellations. It has its own orbit, which is also tilted, we learned before, up to 5 degrees off. Go back to the original latitude of the moon, and see if the moon is inclined to the north or to the south of the constellations. Up to 5 degrees each way, we learned. If you find that the true position of the moon in the constellations off the equator and its own deviation off the constellations in the same direction, if they were both to the north of the equator or both to the south of the equator, then you add the inclination of the constellation plus the moon's extra offset, and you bring those both of those numbers together, and then you have the final number. What if they were in 2 opposite directions? Which means the moon's true position in the constellations was south, but the moon itself was off the constellations and dropped to the north of the constellations. Or the opposite, that the constellations were to the north of the equator and the moon itself was a bit south of the constellations, as we learned in the previous chapters. Then if they're in 2 opposite directions, then subtract the smaller number from the larger number. Let's say if the moon's position was northerly of the constellation, but the moon's true position was in the constellation that is north of the equator, but the moon's latitude itself was south, then you subtract the angular distance, the latitude, which is always only up to 5 degrees, from the position in the equator, position in the constellations, which is a bit greater, let's say, in this number. Vanishar, whichever it is, you take the smaller number away from the bigger number. And what's left is the direction of the moon, the position of the moon off the equator, to the north or to the south, depending on where the bigger number was. Whatever the bigger number was, that's the direction of the moon, north or south. Once you know if the moon is north or south of the equator and by how many degrees, now we can proceed further to ask the witnesses this question. Now the Rambam is going to give an example of his calendar. Keitzad Halacha Yud Aleph. How do we do this? We want to know how much is the moon inclined off the equator. On the night of the sighting of the moon of that year, which was what we said before, Wednesday night, after sundown, the second of Iyar of that year. We already know that the true position of the moon was 19 degrees of Taurus, of the bull star sign. So therefore, it is north of the equator, about 18 degrees. Again, he's not being exact here, approximate is enough. And because it's just a few minutes larger, and it makes no difference about this question to which angle the moon will be. And then the latitude, the first latitude of the moon, was south, 4 degrees. So now they're in two opposite directions. So subtract 4 from 18, you are left with 14 degrees. So therefore, the larger number was to the north, so now the moon is far off the equator, 14 degrees northerly. Shari Amin and Arav was a larger number, which was 18 degrees. It's fine, it was north. This is all approximate, not exactly, because it will not make a difference whether we will see the moon. It will only make a difference to which direction it is. So now he moves on to the total, to the bottom line, how we figure this out. If you desire to know the direction, the direction to which the moon is appeared to be inclined, when they look at it, to which direction is the moon pointing? First thing you need to know is how far off the equator it is, to the right or to the left, from America, from Israel, whether it's going to be more north or more south from anywhere you are compared to the equator. If it'll be at 0 or 180 degrees exactly, or according to the moon's calculations, if it's directly on the equator, so it says like this: if the calculation comes out, if the calculation total comes out that the moon is on the equator or a bit off the equator, 2 or 3 degrees, whether it's 2 degrees to the right or 2 degrees to the left, to the eye of the witnesses, the moon will still appear to be directly above the sun. That the moon's horns, the circle, the crescent, will face west. And the pegima, the crescent, will appear pointed, to the east, because the moon is setting in the west, so the 2 horns will be facing up east. The missing part of the moon is on the eastern side, which is very logical, very simple. The sun's light goes to the moon, the sun set, the moon is just moving away from the sun, so the sun is shining on the moon from on bottom, but it's literally just behind the moon. Slightly the moon is off it to the east. So therefore the sun always illuminates half the moon, but to us is only the edge of it is visible. So when the sun is under the moon, we will always see the light projecting upward, which means we will see the crescent facing straight up to the east. Yud Gimel, if it will be, as we said in the Rambam's example, for instance, it will be off the equator to the north, then the moon will appear that it is between the west and north, which means northwest. And the crescent will appear to be facing from east towards the north, which means when we look from Israel towards west, it will be to the right side. And depending on how far north it is, if it's a little bit north, it will be slightly facing up the crescent. If it will be very north, it'll be almost like almost kind of vertical. The more north it moves, the more vertical it is, because it's to the right side of the sun. So the light comes up at an angle. Halacha Yudalet, Vima Yerachik Me'ala Kav HaShav L'Draima Olam. If the moon is off the equator to the south, then the moon will appear in the position of southwest. And then the crescent will be inclining towards away from east. It will be pointed northeast. How far it is, so if the moon will be south to the left of the sun, then it will appear to be pointing, why is it saying northeast? We're looking at west, so the moon is setting into the west. The north is to the left at that point. So therefore, it will be seen on the northwest side. That makes sense. And the crescent will appear east. Why is he saying southeast? Oh, southeast. He says here northeast. The crescent will appear to be pointed. In the first halacha Yud Gimel, he says southeast. If the moon is to the north of the equator, okay, I get it, because the sun is always on the other side of the moon. When we're looking from Israel, wherever the moon is, the moon will always be to the left of the sun if it's on south. So if the moon is to the left of the sun, it faces in that direction. Okay. Halacha Tesvav. Now, when we ask the witnesses, so till now we dealt with the question of asking the witnesses which way are the horns pointing. So whichever direction the sun is, the moon is away from the sun. If it's to the north of the sun, which then it appears higher up in the sky, it's facing the up and slightly to the right. If it's to the left of the sun, the horns are facing up and slightly to the left. And that's how we can cross-examine the witnesses. But we also asked them another question. How high in the sky did the moon appear off the horizon? This we can figure out from the previous arc of the sighting. In other words, how far up the moon was off the horizon. If it was a very short one, like we said, like 9 degrees or 10 degrees, then it will appear that the moon is very close to the earth. If the arc is long, like we said, 14 degrees, 15 degrees, sometimes up to 20, depending on which season of the year, then it looks like it's high off the ground, off the earth, off the horizon. Depending on how long the arc of the sighting is, that's how we can determine how high it looks like to the eyes of the witnesses. The Mishnah actually uses expressions 1 floor up, 2 floors up, 3 stories high, giving them like such an approximation the way they see it. So we want to corroborate that their testimony is actual is a fact. If they say they see the moon high up and we know it was very low, we can suspect their testimony. Halacha Tazayin. Conclusion of Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. We have explained all the calculations necessary for not knowing if we can for the sighting of the moon, and how we examine the witnesses. So everything will be comprehensible to people of understanding, like we said before. Someone that wants to research this, the Rambam wrote it for them. They will not lack any knowledge of some of the Torah paths, and you will not need to go forth and search for these calculations in other texts. So you can know everything from the Torah. Therefore, he included it in this book. He concludes with a verse from Isaiah chapter 34. Seek out the book of Hashem and read it. None of these will be lacking. This concludes Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. Thank you for watching.
So these are the survivors who made it through. Okay, we've concluded the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m., Rabbi Rose will be continuing with Hilchas Tinius, which I can assure you, if you did fall a bit off the rails over the last week or two, tomorrow night's a good time to get back into the swing of things. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, Leanne, I think I shouldn't say none the wiser, somewhat wiser. A little bit of hair comes in here and there. There's the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh is something that you need to prepare for weeks and months in advance, and really, it's all very simple math. It's not. It's nothing. It's just complex calculations and takes a lot of time to go through. But it's not. Anyways, be that as it may. Oh, yeah, David, you have a question.
Yeah, just an observation that Rabbi Lipsker is very knowledgeable and he puts it over very well. But the problem is that he's doing it from the aspect of Israel, from the 32 degrees north of the equator. And that's what makes it more complicated for us, because when he says southeast or southwest or whatever, it's the opposite for us.
Yeah, but only thing is, we need to remember that when we, according to halacha, the new month does follow the position of Jerusalem.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's not just Rabbi Lipsker. I mean, that's what the Rambam is writing.
Yeah.
Okay, have a great day and a good Shabbos, everyone. And of course, tonight is a very special Shabbos, the 10th of Shvat, 71st anniversary of the Rebbe's leadership. So you can use it out in many special ways. And we'll see you next Friday. Or with Rabbi
Thanks,
Rose.
everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Shabbos, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.